I would like to welcome Philip Brown, who's Managing Director of Capital Markets for Citi, and I'm going to say someone who is a dynamo, a legend in capital markets and in bond markets, and is working damn hard despite his legacy business lines, because he deals with every sovereign in the region, to turn himself into a green dynamo. There's a whole story at coffee break afterwards you can quiz him on. But in the meantime, Philip, thank you for taking on this panel. This is a complicated session because there are two people coming in online. Good luck.
Thank you very much, Sean. And I don't think anybody could be as big a dynamo for the cause as you. But indeed, at Citi, all things green have gone to this guy called Brown. But nevertheless, we're doing great things. I think this panel today is potentially the most interesting of the day. And, congratulations to Sean and the team at Climate Bonds for pulling this group together. Not me, but I mean this group and the group online. Because I think the taxonomies, which were a very theoretical, complex sort of sideshow in previous years, are now becoming a very real issue, a very tangible issue, particularly within Europe, as the SFDR, the disclosure regime, kicks in from January 23, and the CSDR will kick in shortly thereafter, and everybody is going to have to start reporting against the taxonomy. And I think we all think about the taxonomy. I mean, we have it as a Bible to look for. We find it useful, but it's very complicated. And I think one of the biggest criticisms, I think that I should say people have, we find it helpful, we find it useful as just what it is, but it's very complex, and I wouldn't like to have to be our chief financial officer who's got to actually report against it. And that report has got to be audited. It's very complex. So I think in a reflection of that, the EU has put together the Platform on Sustainable Finance, a whole series of expert working groups. And Mariana, who we have with us today, I hope. Helena. Mariana is also important, but Helena is the one I'm speaking of. Helena is the rapporteur to the sub-working group number 5 on usability and data. And we're very lucky to have Helena here with us right now, because her working group published very recently, on the 11th of October, the Usability and Data Report. And I urge you all to read it. It's only 170 pages, and it's a supremely impressive document. I confess I read the first 20, and then turned the page at 1, 2, skip a few, 99, 100. But it's superb. It's a really impressive document. And I just reflect, having looked after green bonds at Citi since 2007, when I would argue the EIB issued the first green bond, but maybe the World Bank would say they did. But I've been in the market a long time. I'm immersed in the market, but I was reading this report. I was just super impressed. The complexity. It's striking how the level of sophistication and complexity has just gained speed in recent years. And I think climate change and green finance has really transformed from a kind of loosey-goosey ideology to a science of hard facts and data. And, I think this usability report that's been published is fantastic, and I think it will become a real Bible. And I hope that the Commission will adopt all of the recommendations. But anyway, I'm talking too much about Helena and the EU taxonomy. Let me introduce our other panelists. We're also pleased to have with us on the screen today Mariana Escobar-Uribe, who is working for the financial regulator in Colombia as a senior advisor. And Mariana has worked, I think, with Bridget's team and Sean's team at the Climate Bond Initiative to publish the first taxonomy in Latin America. And I think it's going to be very interesting to speak to Mariana about her experiences there, and whether, to what extent Mariana was able to draw from the huge amount of work that has been done in Europe with the EU taxonomy Then we have happily with me on the platform today, Ingrid Holmes. And Ingrid is also super interesting to every Englishman and every English businessman and every English banker. So Ingrid is working for the Green Finance Institute, which is a new institute set up just a few years ago by the late Roger Gifford, Mayor of the City of London. And Ingrid is leading the work on the UK Green Taxonomy, which I think I actually myself haven't heard a very great deal about. So it's going to be very interesting to hear from Ingrid to what extent the UK has been able to take second mover advantage from Brexit. You knew there was an advantage there somewhere. Maybe Ingrid is going to tell us what it is today. And then happily we've got Bridget with us also on the panel. And Bridget is leading the taxonomy work streams at CBI. And Bridget is working with regulators and markets all around the world. So I think it'll be interesting just to hear a little bit from Bridget later on. So with that long-winded introduction, may I turn first of all to Helena. And Helena, thank you so much for joining us today. If possible, I would like to have a conversation. So if Helena says something which Mariana finds outrageous, please, Mariana, interrupt or please speak up and say so. And similarly, Ingrid, if you feel you have something to add to the remarks that you hear, let's have a conversation and see how it goes. But Helena, once again, congratulations on the report that's just been published. Please, could you just tell us a little bit more about the report and what have you found to be the biggest challenges that you faced when preparing the report, and what do you think are the most important findings for the market at large?
Well, good morning, Philip. Because I do, hopefully there you go. Hope you can hear me well. And thank you so much for your kind words. It's really appreciated because let me tell you, it did take a lot of hours and a lot of work. I'm telling you, and not only of the rapporteurs who were the authors, but from the entire group and from a lot of people externally. So do not miss the appendix because you have the impressive list of everyone who had contributed and made it possible. So in terms of the report, how to summarize the report and the 64 recommendations that we give the European Commission in 2 or 3 minutes. I will start by saying, not that every single chapter is really important on its own right, but I would like to highlight 3. The first one is around data, yeah? Everyone we talk about, they always say the problem with the taxonomy is the lack of data. The problem with the taxonomy is the implementation of particularly do no significant harm. So in that chapter, you have a hell of a lot of recommendations and explanations on how you can make it work, but more importantly, on what needs to happen to make it much more workable. To your point around what type of recommendations were given, and to give you a little hint, for corporates, for example, so one of the key hurdles is to interpret actually the activity, yeah, to really well understand the activity that it's included, and then how to define the financial flows, that actually are generated from that activity. So there's a list of recommendations from, for example, creating guidance on the interpretation on some of the criteria. Sometimes there's interpretative criteria. How do you define minimize, right? Or, for example, when it refers to EU regulation, can we have like the key points of that regulation, so that it's much easier to implement. Provide guidance on, for example, another thing, it's on what is good enough in order to decide that it's aligned when the criteria is process-based, yeah? So that's what that chapter looks at. It also looks very important for the investors and financial institutions in the room. That is probably the number one hurdle for them, which is what to do with the non-EU, non-CSRD companies. That is how to include those companies that do not have to report, on the taxonomy. On that, the regulation, and sorry for all the acronyms, the disclosures regulation allows for what is called equivalent information. Yeah, so when you don't have the exact reporting, what do you do? So the report makes very clear recommendations on how to the Commission on how equivalent information should look like, and what should be the criteria for qualifying as equivalent information. The other chapter that is really interesting, I think, it's the chapter on regulation, because you said the taxonomy is the Bible. I like to think about it as a dictionary. Yeah, so the taxonomy is the dictionary for this common language within the EU, and now what we need is two things. One is we need the grammar. We need to understand the grammar, and the grammar is this bigger puzzle, which is the sustainable finance regulatory framework, and how the different pieces connect with each other. For example, the taxonomy, how do you use it when you are building your portfolios that you want to register as Article 8 or 9, as for people who are not familiar with the details, as a green fund or as an ESG fund, and commercializes as such. And so that chapter looks at fine-tuning, all these pieces within, that bigger puzzle, which is the sustainable finance and regulatory, because we need to understand that the different pieces were developed and negotiated separately. Right, so there are some inconsistencies, and there are, for example, in terms of definitions, we found 4 different definitions of do no significant harm. Can we, make it much more consistent? Can we make a difference from when we talk about do no significant harm activity level versus entity level, and so forth? So that's a chapter for those really interested on that achieving greater consistency. And the last one that I would like to talk about in my introductory remarks, it's the last chapter, because it looks at, and I think it's particularly relevant for this panel, it looks at the international considerations, and basically looks at how to make the taxonomy, EU taxonomy, more internationally friendly. Number 2, it looks at a very special case, I think, which is the investments in developing countries and development finance. The taxonomy cannot be a hurdle for those investments, for investments where they're most needed, so we have treated them as a special case together with SMEs. And last but not least, what about the global taxonomies? How can we work towards a common framework that makes it much more operable? So loads of content, 64 recommendations, and I'm looking forward for, continuing the discussion.
Great. So thank you, Helena. So I want to go round the panel really, and then we will come back to you, but we've got lots of questions. I've got one. I'm going to be a bit cheeky and just ask one quick question now to you, if I may. But so you've now submitted this report. It's become public. The Commission is reading it. Should we expect a revised taxonomy very soon? Because I think the regulation kicks in almost immediately. So should we expect a new revised taxonomy taking account of all of your recommendations?
No, not a new taxonomy. If we go back to what we said, this is what we need, as I was saying, that we have the dictionary, right? This common language. What we're now going to have is guidance on how to apply it. So, for example, if in the climate delegated acts, there is some language that can be interpreted of a different manner. What we expect is to then provide a clarification on that. If the climate delegated acts about, mentions a substantial contribution, makes reference to an EU labeling or certificate, then what we're asking is to have a mapping like a translator on how that labeling, what it is in the UK, for example, right? So these are the type of recommendations that we make. There are recommendations that go directly into the regulation, but not the actual text of the taxonomy regulation, but what is called the delegated acts and the guidance. So for those who are not familiar, you have the number one text, that's called a directive or a regulation that is negotiated between the three parties, the European Commission, the Parliament, and the Council. And then you have what it is, the delegated acts level 2, and many times level 3. Many times that level 3 is carried out by the European Supervisory Authority. So the changes are proposing on level 2 and level 3 not to reopen the negotiations.
Okay, great. Well, please, if in the audience, if you have questions, I will turn to you shortly, and you'll have a chance to put those to you. But thank you, Helena. As I say, it's a super impressive piece of work that you've done. And turning then to Mariana, if I may. So Mariana, congratulations to you for leading the work to have the first taxonomy for Latin America in Colombia. And I wonder if I could ask, how much did you draw upon the huge amount of work that had been done in Europe? Was that relevant to what the challenges you faced and the work that you wanted to do in Colombia? It'd be really interesting to hear just how you think a taxonomy should look in a Latin American context. Is there any similarity with the way the Europeans have thought about it?
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the congratulations. So basically, when an emerging market, and I am going to take here, I'm going to be the voice of the emerging markets, but when an emerging markets makes a decision or wants to make a decision on a taxonomy or having a local taxonomy or embark in this type of project, I think we are faced with a decision based on three different roads. We can either adopt one, adopt one, or develop one from scratch, right? From the outset, the Superintendencia Financiera specifically was committed to adapting the internationally recognized taxonomies to the local context. So we wanted to basically draw upon the European Union one, which was the most extensive one, the more granular one, the one that's being recognized or that was being recognized by international investors specifically or financial market participants. So we wanted to draw mainly from the European Union one and adapt it to the Colombian context, policies, programs, commitments, because we have different commitments, we have different markets, we have different environmental impacts. For example, in the Colombian context, the land use sector is the one that causes the most greenhouse gas emissions. So we had different structure associated to our emissions and our contribution to global emissions. And we knew we wanted to draw upon what was being done by the European Union, but adjusted or adapted to the local context. So in that sense, one of the main learning lessons for me, and one of I think the biggest discussion we have initially when developing the local taxonomy was basically looking or defending the idea that we needed to adapt. This was mostly due because the Superintendencia has a central role in its development. As you know, in different emerging market economies, different actors or stakeholders are leading the development. In Peru, it's the Ministry of Environment. In Chile and Mexico, it's the Ministry of Finance. In Colombia was a team between the Ministry of Finance and the Superintendencia Financiera. And the Superintendencia Financiera understood that in order to mobilize more capital, especially private capital from international investors, we needed to minimize the transaction costs for them. So we needed to draw upon what was being done, that was being recognized, but using the local data, regulation, commitments, information we had in order to develop the technical screening criteria and to develop and adjust the do not significant harm principle. In general, and after we conducted this process, it took us 2 years to develop the local taxonomy. We made a decision specifically on the land use sector, because what we saw from international taxonomies was that what was being done for land use did not apply to the Colombian context, specifically for the sector. So at the end of the day, in the Colombian case, and I feel it's going to be the case in some emerging markets, there is going to be a mixture between developing something for certain sectors in order to respond to the local context, but also adapting in other more traditional sectors such as energy, construction, transportation. We're going to have more of an adaptation of the European Union taxonomy.
Great.
Just to in the Colombian taxonomy was launched in April. It took us 2 years, as I said before, to develop, and it covers 10 sectors of the economy and 50 assets or economic activities that contribute substantially to climate change mitigation. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you, Mariana. I think for many investors, when they think about ESG in the context of emerging markets, the G is as important as the other two letters. And, I think to have produced such a taxonomy is an impressive illustration of the strong governance that you have in Colombia. So congratulations to you. May I turn to Ingrid? And Ingrid, every Englishman is, I don't know, we don't think yet of the UK as an emerging market, although some people think we might be headed fast in that direction. But can you tell us a little bit about, we haven't heard as much as we should, I think, of the UK taxonomy. Can you just tell us a little bit, who mandated you? Who are you working for? How long have you been at it? And have you been able to take this sort of second mover advantage? Have you looked at the feedback that came from the taxonomy, and how will the UK taxonomy differ from the EU?
Just to answer the last question first, yes, we have been able to take advantage of being a fast follower to the EU. It's been a really positive starting point for us. But just to go back to the beginning, GTAG has been, the Green Technical Advisory Group, GTAG for short, has been running now for nearly 16 months. We were established as an independent expert group to advise the UK government on the design and implementation of a UK taxonomy, taking the EU taxonomy as its starting point. While I chaired the initiative, it was spearheaded by the then Economic Secretary to the Treasury, John Glenn, and the taxonomy has since passed into the hands of the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Andrew Griffiths. So one of the challenges we've been having as a group, getting our thinking out into the wider discussion, is that sort of political instability that we are working through collectively at the moment. But we have made great progress in those 15 months. We have 18 members on our group, and a number of them actually also sit on the EU platform. It was really important to have that knowledge brought right into the heart of the GTAG's work. We've released a series of tranches of paper as private advice to officials in the Treasury on particularly the data and usability issues, but lots of other issues about how do you think about onshoring EU technical screening criteria when we have a different net zero emission trajectory in the UK, arguably at the time going further and faster. So we did make the decision a couple of weeks ago actually to put the first tranches of our advice into the public domain. The point was that we had done a lot of thinking that we felt from our private discussions with other jurisdictions, EU, Australians, Chile, Singapore were useful contributions into the international debate, because we do ultimately want there to be a single global taxonomy. And so I'll just pull out the three sort of main headlines from that. One was, when we were looking at whether actually it made sense for the EU framework to be a starting point for the UK taxonomy, the answer was definitively yes, for very practical reasons. First, a huge amount of intellectual effort, heavy lifting, has gone into the EU framework. But also very practically, 80% of our equities, 50% of our debt in managed assets in the UK are invested in overseas markets. So that international interoperability is absolutely key. That said, we have got areas we want to go further and faster in the UK. So the advice to government was adopt some, revise some, keep the same concepts, methodologies, metrics and thresholds wherever you can. But if there is a significant divergence in ambition, then there is a case to adapt. So that's the first piece. Second piece is, it was no surprise to us that the EU came out with some of the challenges around do no significant harm. If you look at taking the FTSE All Cap as a proxy for the economy, and you look at taxonomy alignment on the basis of revenues, alignment is something around 5 to 6%. If you then introduce do no significant harm compliance requirements, it goes down to about 0.6%. So it tells you it's not a particularly useful transparency tool if you're requiring mandatory alignment to count as being eligible. So we think there's a real need to look at reducing the elaborateness of the do no significant harm piece, very much along the lines that Helena has talked about. So streamlining, but keeping the ambition. And I think importantly, we know there's going to be harm. So should the framework actually be focused on identifying risk and introducing CapEx plans to remediate that risk, and that counts as compliance. So we're actually going to outsource that thinking to external researchers and hopefully have a contribution that will be useful not just for UK decision making, but internationally as well. And I think the third piece I'd highlight is looking at the adaptation taxonomy. A lot of the requirements are very process-based rather than outcomes-focused. And what I mean by that is we are already living in a climate that is changing. We need to be thinking about what resilience actually means. The taxonomy is an infrastructure taxonomy, so I think there's a real case to be made for looking beyond adaptation to what does a resilient set of economic assets look like. So we're kicking off a piece of new work to look at both infilling some of the missing pieces of the taxonomy around agriculture and particularly key to resilience, fisheries, looking again at forestries, but this broader resilience agenda, which will require a different approach because actually we need to think about this on a systems basis. So I'm quite excited about where that's going to.
And I think as Helena described then, the taxonomy is the dictionary. And what about the usability? Are we going to need a guide to grammar to understand how to apply it when it comes out? Have you drawn lessons from the usability issue that I think the end users are concerned about?
So you're quite right, Philip. There's the taxonomy itself, the dictionary, but also how it is applied. And that's the missing piece in the UK context currently. We were expecting the sustainability disclosure regulation to be announced as part of the financial services bill. That's been dropped. Actually, I think we're not ready. So my sense is we need to slow things down, get the taxonomy itself right, that's what we're working on now, but also give a lot of thought to some of the key performance indicators around the SDR piece so that we make sure that firms are reporting useful information to the market. So CapEx is key, revenues is key, question marks around whether OpEx is actually useful, and there is a lot around particularly how financial institutions report that we need to interrogate further. So again, very much learning from some of the lessons being pulled out from the EU's report, and those are very active discussions we're having with the key government departments. The implementation routes, of course, are Companies Act, which sits under BEIS. Got a very regulation skeptic minister in charge of BEIS at the moment, shall we say, but also there's a route through the FCA through amendments to public listing rules. So we are in active discussions with both those departments on routes forward.
Right. And many of the major UK companies, as you say, are active overseas, and many of them will then be reporting under the EU taxonomy, potentially before they do the same under the UK. How will companies manage this sort of dual requirements?
So this goes back to my point about if we're going to deviate on the UK taxonomy, let's minimise the deviation as much as possible. So taking the same approach but potentially requiring different thresholds for compliance means you should not have to churn out multiple different data sets. That's something we're really live to. But of course, UK capital markets are part of a global system, so there are lots of taxonomies out there. You can probably bunch them up into similar groups. Asia is one set, led by MAS in Singapore. We hope that the EU-UK will be very similar. Not sure what's going to happen in the US, so you might end up having to report against multiple different sets of taxonomies. But if this is a transparency tool, I think that's quite useful. I think it's quite useful to know where capital is flowing, where we need to increase investment. That's one goal of the taxonomy in terms of the transparency piece. But the other piece is, as an investor, there are different shades of green, right? So maybe we need to have that information displayed in a way that represents different jurisdictions' views on it.
Great. I'm very happy to hear that you find consultation with banks is very important before the regulation comes. So I'm sure my colleagues will be comforted by that commitment. So maybe turning to Bridget, I think page 165 of Helena's report refers to this multiplicity of taxonomies, and the word taxomania is mentioned. And I think, Bridget, you are working with many regulators around the world. I mean, how many taxonomies does the world need? And how should these taxonomies talk to each other? Could you just talk a little bit about your experience there?
Yeah, I think you'll find that was page 166.
Was it?
But yeah. So
I stand corrected.
I mean, yeah. So at the Climate Bonds Initiative, we have been working with regulators, governments, and in some countries it's not run by the public sector, so private institutions as well, working on taxonomies. And I mean, in a way, the usability report that's come out from the EU now gives us a bit of a pause, I think, to think about what have we got and then what do we need, and particularly around that interoperability piece. So what do we have is a huge opportunity, really, to see a kind of, I like that idea of a single taxonomy, a single definition of green. Now, it's never going to be one single thing, but I really liked what Tony said in the last panel. You can either be simple but wrong or complex but right. And I think what we have is something that is complex, but it is right. And so we need to quite kind of hang on to that as the opportunity for taxonomies to provide that kind of global and transparent set of definitions. I mean, I think it's worth reflecting back sort of 15, 20 years when I started on this, and everybody's definitions were very different and were very black box. And now we at least have this opportunity to kind of sing off the same hymn sheet, even if we're not quite there yet. So that's, we have that. It's not the perfect, but it is the good. And now what do we do to kind of facilitate what this lovely word that we keep hearing about, interoperability? I had to look it up in the dictionary. What do we mean by that in the taxonomy space? We mean kind of speaking the same language, trying to connect together. And that doesn't always mean that they'll say the same thing. We're working a lot on what interoperability means, and particularly on tools for the market to create that. So do we need lots and lots of different taxonomies? Ideally, no. But there is a real value in each country or region having something that they have ownership over. And we have seen this. In Indonesia, we saw the taxonomy process brought together all the key ministries that had, some stake in the criteria. It was a very complex process, quite tortuous, you can imagine. But it was quite important because that buy-in process, which we've seen a lot working with different government institutions, has been key for local taxonomy. So having something locally that you can say, we have buy-in in our country around this taxonomy is incredibly important. But at the same time, as Ingrid reflected, as minimal differences as possible globally. So we're going to see many different taxonomies. The question is, are we also going to see some kind of adapters to help us adapt the UK plug to the EU plug? And that's what we're working on a lot at Climate Bonds, to figure out tools that we can map them together and then use that for the market. So we're working on that a lot, and also to plug some of the gaps, because there clearly are gaps on what taxonomies currently cover, and resilience is a huge one, and particularly getting buy-in for emerging markets. We cannot just talk about mitigation. It's not credible. So that, bringing in resilience is really, really key.
Am I right in thinking there was a CBI taxonomy? And is there still a CBI taxonomy? To what extent is there room for a CBI taxonomy? Technology, we need
CBI
it.
technology, I like the idea of that. Yes, there is a CBI taxonomy. It's based on the work we do in the standards team to come up with global criteria for different sectors. So it's based on that. There is certainly room for that, and the interoperability tools we're working with will utilise that, because what we've done at Climate Bonds is try to make everything we have globally applicable and not locally specific, so that, you know, if you have something that can be metrics and targets and standards that can be used around the world. So this is one of the tools, but it clearly needs to be adapted a bit. I mean, to what extent is it still relevant? I think very useful in the interoperability discussions, but in the same breath, we're extremely delighted that we have kind of regulators entering this space and, you know, bringing local taxonomies to the fore, because that makes it even more powerful. So, you know, to the extent that the Climate Bonds taxonomy is already being used and has been used by various government institutions or others around the world in their taxonomy developments, we're obviously delighted, and we're maintaining that taxonomy so it continues to be used as a tool.
Right. I wonder if I could come back to you, Helena. And I was interested to hear Ingrid say that if we apply the FTSE all-cap index to the EU taxonomy, we see maybe a 5% alignment. What happens if we put the all-cap Euro stocks to the EU taxonomy? And, you know, should we be aiming for, is the end goal 100% alignment? Or, you know, should a company feel somehow, I don't want to say somehow second best, should a company be concerned if their alignment with the taxonomy is very low? And should, I've heard had conversations with some investors who feel they follow a very close environmental investment philosophy, but they find their alignment number very low. Can you just tell us a little bit about, you know, how we should interpret the output from the reporting that will come from the taxonomy and the regulation? Is that a fair question?
Thank you. And first, if you allow me, I want to give or respond to Ingrid, because she made a very good point around OPEX, yeah? And I want to clarify that in the the technical expert group, we did not recommend OPEX. So we said, when relevant, you know, include OPEX. And the reason why we included it was because, as you know, in some green bonds, there might be some expenditures that come out from the operational, expenditures bucket. And at the same time, we were aware that for some SMEs, they might not really, when they invest, they might not invest in CapEx formally, there's more like operational expenditure. So that was the only reason why we added in the tech, but somehow on the process, that when relevant became an and, yeah? So to the point that when you read the report, it actually recommends that when it comes to financial products, you skip the OPEX as it was already excluded for financial institutions reporting. So that was just like one point I thought it might be of interest. On your question, Philip, I think that the problem with the taxonomy is that it's the expectations that are out in the market based on the previous, state of affairs. When we're used to those green funds where the minimum percentage of green activities used to be 20% at the very least, yeah? And funds tended to be 50, 60%, aligned with the own taxonomy of the market participant or from one of the other taxonomies, like industry-based taxonomies. And now we move into a taxonomy, a definition that Ingrid is absolutely right. Some of the estimates that you will find in the report are even much lower, yeah? But these estimates are around revenues. And what we need to understand is two things. First, that the taxonomy was there, and probably what is best fitted is at company level, at asset level, to guide that transition and actually to be able to use the taxonomy to raise funds. And I'll explain that in a second. How it works, and let me give you an example. Let's imagine there's an utility, an electrical power company, and it has two plants, to make it very simple. One is taxonomy aligned, so 50%, imagine, let's say 50% of the revenues, very rare case, is aligned with that taxonomy, yeah? But at the same time, that same company can be 100% aligned from a CapEx perspective. Why? Because the taxonomy for the very first time allows a company to say, well, I'm going to invest in my second plant to make it much more sustainable, to reduce emissions, and I'm going to use the taxonomy to raise that funds. So I will develop a plan for in 5 years, I'm going to lower those emissions, I'm going to meet the target. All the financing that that company uses can be considered as green, and the financial instruments attached to it will be green. And if we look at, so far, before the taxonomy was implemented, how much, this greenium in the market, the demand for green bonds and green-based financial instruments. Imagine when the whole, and this is why the whole puzzle, you need to understand really the part of the taxonomy, you need to understand the entire puzzle, which is the sustainable finance package. When half of the European market who has declared itself ESG or green is going to report on the taxonomy, and all those financial market participants for all those funds are going to have a vested interest in increasing that percentage. So any company that has a good percentage of alignment is really attractive. But hold on, even for equity, for the very first time, you're going to be able to use CapEx. So you can have a company that is 0% aligned from a revenue perspective, which is 100% from a CapEx perspective, and use the CapEx finally to build your portfolios. For a long time, investors have been saying that the most valuable indicator, it was on the TCFD report of last year, is CapEx. Yeah, this is where I'm proving that I'm walking the talk. And this is what people need to understand, that the beauty of the taxonomy, and this is why I always say CapEx, CapEx, CapEx. And it's not to say revenues are not important, they are, but they are more backward looking. CapEx and the plans attached to them, it's the most significant contribution, in my opinion, to this market. And I think the debt market, and this change for the first time at portfolio level and for green and ESG funds that can use CapEx as a critical indicator to select their companies and it's a massive step forward, because this is the bottom line, is that when the whole machinery will start working, companies who put their money to transition and align with the taxonomy will have access to cheaper capital. And that's the whole point, to really finance the transition. I think I have answered your question, hopefully, but happy to draw on, and explain, more on the details about that.
No, you have. Thank you very much, Helena. I think we all think of the taxonomy as a stick, and it's nice that you talk of the carrot, of the advantages of moving to align and sustainability going forward. I don't know if Ingrid, you have anything to add.
Yeah, no, I mean, I 100% agree with Helena, and this is a new way of corporates reporting. And I think actually when they start looking at CapEx plans, you'll find that the taxonomy is far more relevant than it might appear at first sight. So if you're a supermarket, actually, if you're investing in a fleet of electric vehicles, that's a big capital expenditure that's taxonomy aligned. Thinking about your building fabric, that's probably going to have some taxonomy eligibility. And just on this point about, what's the taxonomy for in terms of positive incentives? It is a way of starting to make sustainability visible in how capital is priced. And we are starting to hear stories, they're anecdotes, about taxonomy-aligned companies with banks fighting over who's going to basically provide the debt capital to them, because the banks themselves want to be taxonomy aligned in their lending. So this is exactly the kind of positive reinforcing impact we want to see. So yeah, just 100% support Helena's comments.
I think we already see that already, and the amount of data that is available already today is impressive. I mean, Bloomberg has been, I think, an important contributor, Helena, to your working group, and the data which Bloomberg publishes now against every single security is tremendously impressive. one of the Jane Fraser in her opening remarks this morning spoke of the importance of security, and you can't really have sustainability without security. And it's very interesting to see to compare the ESG data of the various defense manufacturing companies around Europe. And historically, we would have thought of that as subject to an exclusionary criteria. But it is interesting today that we no longer see that. And it's possible to see, how many Article 8 funds are holding the equity of defense manufacturers, for example. I think this is going to very quickly have teeth. But is there anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question to have the opportunity of our distinguished panel today? Does anybody have a question? Anybody? Just the one? I can't believe it. Can we? There's another. Come on, one more. I should run an auction. Maybe we'll have 3 questions at once. But please, over on the right-hand side.
Ingrid, your comments that you can use CapEx to raise financing, and I understand that. But if I have to take that to the logical conclusion, then the standards of the standards of green bonds and the climate, in fact, the climate bonds also becomes redundant, because then is it what you're saying is that these taxonomy standards are going to be applicable both on the asset deployment side as well as the liability side? Have I been able to explain my question?
I think your question is clear. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll just take all the questions and let the panel answer them or pick and choose. But please, the gentleman at the back in the shirt and tie.
Hello. Ryan Frill, LBW. A question about the taxonomies. So they're referred to as, or labelled as green a lot, but for me, to include, say, cement companies, they're carbon intensive. Do you think it'd be more sensible to label them transition, for example? Because it could lead to greenwash because we have to report our green asset ratio as part of the EBA guidelines. So you could have one company that has cement that's eligible for the taxonomy, another one that does renewable energy, and they'd both be classified the same.
Thank you. Thank you. A third question just to put to the panel? Anybody? Okay, well, let's start with those 2 then. So the first question, is the taxonomy going to ultimately supersede the need to label debt financing as being green? If it's taxonomy aligned, does it no longer need to be called a green bond, for example? And I think the second question there was really, should this be the green taxonomy or the transition taxonomy? It's interesting that if we look at the labels in the market, I think transition is the label that is perhaps least understood and least used. And perhaps it would be helpful. I think there was also a question from the gentleman from LBW just with regard to greenwashing. That's something that we are everybody is concerned about greenwashing. I think the regulators are beginning to be concerned about greenwashing. We're having regulatory MiFID-related discussions. How do you think about greenwashing, and where does that fit into the conversation that we're having today? So there are 3 questions there. I made up the third, but I don't know. Ingrid, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I'll take the first one. This is a really pertinent issue and definitely something that is front of mind for some of the corporates we've been talking to in the UK who have issued green bonds and are worried about basically the grandfathering issue. It's not straightforward. It's actually one of the issues we're going to be looking at in the next tranche of our work from GTAG. I think, Helena, you've probably done some thinking in the platform about this. But I think it's important to go back to the point of why taxonomies were viewed as being needed. The work that superseded the platform was the high-level expert group on sustainable finance, of which I was a member. And one of the things we heard consistently from the market back then, which was 2018, was we want to do sustainability, but we don't know what it is. We do need an objective definition, which is where the taxonomy has come from. It focuses on where greenhouse gas emissions are greatest and need to be reduced in the economy. And it's from that framework that corporate reporting then follows. So it's a completely different way of reporting compared to green bond standards or ESG data, all the different corporate reporting frameworks out there. But my sense is bringing this back to the failure of capital to be deployed as quickly as we need it to, given the scary climate science these days, but also concerns about greenwashing in the market and the subjective nature of some of the ESG reporting, that we absolutely do need this objective measure. But we also need to, from a practical usability and usefulness point of view, really consider and address this issue of shifting from one system to another and the grandfathering implications around that.
Mariana, would you like to comment on those? Perhaps, is there the concept of greenwashing in emerging markets, or what is the end game for you of how you would like to see the financial markets using your taxonomy?
I think for most emerging markets, and at least that's the case for Colombia, developing a green taxonomy is more of a carrot than a stick, to be honest. It's a way of providing information for decision makers, especially in the financial sectors, regarding where the opportunities are when you're talking about transforming the economy to a greener one. So it's more of a stick, or that's the initial driver, and that's what we saw in Colombia. That's the argument we used. That's how we put it out there. It was its main driver, and I think it's the same in most cases in Latin America, at least. Locally, the way we're implementing the taxonomy, first of all, it has to respond to a graduality. Implementing a taxonomy for certain capital markets participants, specifically, for example, in our case, for banks, which is within the financial industry, the industry that is most advancing in integrating ESG into their processes, in understanding what sustainability means to them, green finance, climate risk. They are the most advanced ones. There is a very high cost in order to really implement and adapt and adopt the taxonomy in their processes. So we have to, its approach for its implementation, it's gradual. So what we decided in Colombia is to start implementing the taxonomy or issuing regulation around the taxonomy regarding product labeling. So we are not yet at the moment in our market. We have a very small capital market. We're not yet in the moment, and we don't think our companies are ready to report against the taxonomy, corporate reporting against the taxonomy. We just implemented TCFD or instructed our issuers to implement TCFD and SASB, and they're not yet ready to start reporting against the taxonomy. So what we decided to start with product labeling, either bonds or funds that have a green last name to it. We're asking them to disclose if they're aligned and how much they're aligned to the taxonomy. And I think for a market like ours, that responds to that graduality that we want, and it's going to give us a lot of information on what are the main barriers, what are the main issues for the taxonomy applicability in this type of markets, small capital markets, where you cannot increase a lot the cost, but that you need to create greater transparency to really mobilize and clarity to mobilize capital effectively.
Yeah. I think that's great, and I think it's very true. I'm happy to hear you talk about the cost of implementation, because it is quite huge, the amount of regulatory reporting that we have to face. And so I still believe that the green labeling, the green bond label, has tremendous value. And here we are today, relatively few years after green bonds were introduced. It's a multi-trillion market, and I think it's certainly the green label has certainly served a very useful purpose and continues to do so. I do agree that we should all use transition rather more, and I think investors have to understand transition. What do you think? Could you just comment on transition, Bridget? I think you are working on, I think we are working with you on standards for shipping, which is a transition industry, for steel, which is a transition industry. But the market seems nervous about this word transition, as if it's somehow not as good as green.
Yeah, and I think, it's quite interesting the approach you take. So, and particularly to the question about cement, which is another transition sector, the criteria in the EU taxonomy, similar in the climate bonds criteria, are to be called green are not currently anywhere near zero. So I think it's quite important to note that there's sort of two types of criteria. For those sectors and activities where there are available options which are near zero, that's the green criteria. But those for which there are not, they're actually not green right now. And the aim is that they follow a pathway down to green. This is called green in the EU taxonomy. It's also called green by the Climate Bonds Initiative. We think that's quite important, because to channel green finance towards these sectors which have been underrepresented in the market, like shipping, like industry, all of these kind of things. But in actual fact, what it gets called, I don't think is particularly important. The main thing is that the funds are channeled there. So under the EU taxonomy and climate bonds, those heavy industry sectors have a pathway to be called green. You could argue that they should be near zero, but then there would be no green finance in those sectors, and I think that would be a missed opportunity. And what does transition mean? I mean, you ask everybody and you get different answers. And what we kind of tend to talk about is that transition towards that green pathway. So if you establish a pathway that is to be green, start now and your trajectory down over time, that what takes you towards that pathway is your transition path. And whatever we do to enable that is quite important. And that can be through our standards, particularly the work we're doing on entity criteria is very important for the whole entity to take that journey towards green, rather than what is at a very activity level within a taxonomy.
Right. Thank you, Bridget. I think I'm afraid we're almost out of time now, but I would urge you all, I think the EU is ahead a little bit, as we've heard today, in terms of the progress towards implementation and regulation. And once again, I want to say this paper that Helena's team have published just a week ago, please Google it, have a look at it. It is very impressive, and I think it's going to become an essential guide to the grammar of sustainable finance going forward. So thank you, Helena, for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Mariana, for joining us. Probably, I don't know, you came a little bit further over the airwaves than for those of us in Europe. And Ingrid, thank you so much. I'm sure we'll hear much more of you in the months and years to come. Hopefully we'll have stability in government very soon. And Bridget, thank you very much for your time. Thank you all.
Thank you, Philip.